quality needs to become king to ensure apples and pears remain strong, year-round competitors on supermarket shelves. We'll get some insights today as to how the grape and other industries have realised that being first to market is not always an advantage, especially if you want to keep consumers on your side.
We found that we were harvesting grapes probably up to 14 days too early, which means we were never going to get the bricks in that product. We were never going to get the consistency and quality, really variable samples. We realised we just ultimately weren't going to satisfy consumers.
Hi there, welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Zealy, and today on APEL's new TV show, we'll continue the conversation about what's happening in the retail landscape. Look at how other commodities are really focusing on working together as an industry with retailers, and the impact achieving consistent quality of their product has made in ensuring they are a weekly shopping basket purchase during their seasonal window. Apples and pears have always had a strong advantage as a staple in Australian homes due to the year-round supply availability. But as research has shown, we're not selling much more fruit than we were 6 years ago. Our category is not growing in volume alongside population growth, and some of these other categories are leading the way when it comes to ensuring consumers receive a quality product on the inside and out every time they make a purchase. A number of commodities are already addressing the need for more consistent quality within the fresh produce space. These commodities, such as table grapes, mangoes, avocados, and berries, are investing in programs to make sure consumers are purchasing their product from the start of the season and continuing to repurchase right through the supply period. So why focus on quality? To make sure they sell more fruit. Repeat purchase is the key to selling more fruit at a good price. On the flip side, we know it takes a consumer 4 to 6 weeks to repurchase produce after a bad eating experience, which is often quality related. Of the industries investing in a quality program, those who have done it well focus on their industry as a complete category, working as a team along the supply chain. It's not differentiated by individual brands or varieties. It's a combined category approach. And one really impressive example is from the table grape industry. Their approach has proven to be successful, with figures showing that the value of the category has grown much faster than their increase in volume. So, what did they do? A few standouts from their approach include they reviewed the quality issue from a whole of category perspective, which is important to note as there are more than 40 varieties of table grapes grown in Australia. They worked as a team with everyone along the supply chain, from growers to packers and retailers. Data was made available to everyone in real time, accessible through an online portal, and they took their time to collect consistent data from 5 different varieties over 2 years to ensure it was reliable and not skewed by seasonal events. Their goal was to increase the consistency within a bunch of grapes, limiting the chance of getting both sweet and sour grapes within the same bunch. The research identified that an increase of sour grapes in a bunch impacted the level of consumer satisfaction. And how did they do it? After the initial 2 years of data collection and consumer research that was done to understand what consumers were looking for in a bunch of grapes, they introduced a minimum maturity standard. Over the 4 seasons since the standard has been adopted by industry, consumer acceptability has increased by 26%, beating their target of 80% and increasing consumer demand. To put this result into context for our industry, over the same period, our volume and value of production haven't really shifted. Yes, we have a relatively strong market position, but are we at risk of losing it if we don't start focusing on quality too? And as we can see here, blueberries are another category that's growing. Their tonnage has increased over the last 6 years, and the data would suggest their volume is growing faster than their value, which may mean they're getting less return for growing more product. So in reality, there is no point reinventing the wheel. Our industry can learn from table grapes' success, and as a result, APAL is adapting and funding the same quality program for apples and pears. It's a proven model, but as we've seen with other successful programs, to work, it will need support from everyone in the industry along our supply chain from grower to retailer. Through the success realised by working with the table grape industry, retailers are going to expect the same from other fresh produce commodities, or eventually they won't work with us. We also think it's important to tackle at consumer level because research has shown that most people only purchase 1 to 2 different apple varieties. If they have a bad eating experience, they don't blame that variety, they blame the category. And then, as we know, it takes 4 to 6 weeks to repurchase. The key things to note are we need commitment along the entire supply chain, from grower through to retail, to make sure we're delivering a consistent quality product. It's important we work together with retailers and invest in programs that support industry growth. And consumers aren't differentiating as much as we'd like to think they are between our different varieties. So you're probably wondering why we're focusing so much on the retailer and why we'd be wanting to form a more collaborative relationship, especially in terms of quality. As I mentioned last week, we are just 2 categories in an increasingly competitive part of the supermarket. Retailers are seeing success in what these other industries are doing to achieve a consistent quality product, and it makes sense they will expect the same from us. So I think now is a nice time to revisit the Q&A with James Stewart, who is the National Leader of Restructuring Services at KPMG, where he specialises in business strategy and retail and consumer brands. And we'll begin the conversation about technology and the accessibility of data. How has technology and the ability to track, record and respond to data in real time impacted the way retailers are using the information they collect as well?
Okay, that's a great question. There's a couple of angles to this that I'll try and cover. So the first angle I'll cover is actually around what I describe as provenance. In other words, increasingly the customer wants to know, where did the produce come from? What were the conditions that the produce was grown in? What were the conditions of the workers who picked or collected that produce? And is the grower somebody that is reputable and has integrity? And that is being enabled through, believe it or not, blockchain technology, which is allowing track and trace in terms of from the farm gate through to the consumer, so that the consumer progressively will get a better and better understanding of the quality of that produce and how that actually comes to market. And KPMG has a product around this called KPMG Origins, which is designed to support this type of journey. The second aspect which I wanted to talk about is that in the pre-COVID days, if you like, what retailers would generally measure, and they still measure this, is sales productivity, margin, inventory turns, all that sort of stuff, all the things that you'd expect they would turn in terms of product being sold in their stores. But it's moved now because of digital and online, is retailers are heavily focused, laser focused on how they track their lifetime customer value. In other words, the relationship with their customer over their whole life through technology. and that'll be through social media, it'll be through their website. They'll be measuring how long people spend on their website, how much research they do around different products, what they focus on when they're on their website, when they're on Instagram or Facebook, what are they looking at, when they're buying online, what are they buying, how long do they spend online, do they abandon their cart frequently, what changes behaviour. So there's a lot of digital benchmarks that are really coming into focus now that 5 years ago really retailers weren't that focused on, and certainly not in fresh food. So this is an evolving proposition as a result of this acceleration phenomenon I talked about, with COVID really accelerating digital disruption across all sort of aspects of our lives.
What are the key drivers for retail, particularly fresh produce, that we need to start becoming more aware of?
I think for fresh produce, one of the things that I really think is important is storytelling. So that sounds like, might sound a little odd, but I think there's a great deal of value from a retailer's perspective and from a brand's perspective to be able to tell the history, the heritage and the integrity of the fresh produce they sell. So I shop for fresh produce. My local shop in Melbourne is a place called La Mana, and it's right next to a supermarket, which I think is a Woolworths supermarket. And when you look at the fresh produce in La Mana versus the fresh produce in Woolworths, I mean, it's chalk and cheese. First of all, the quality is significantly better in La Mana than it is in Woolworths at every level. The experience is significantly better because you're getting that personal touch from what is effectively a family-owned business. The staff, the whole culture of the place is different. You are paying more for it, right? You can't say that you're not. It is more expensive. But to be honest with you, for me, I go, well, this is great. As I said before, I'm a bit of a food snob. So I like to go in there and go, well, actually, I like putting money in the businesses of a family-owned business. That's good. I like supporting a family-owned business. But most importantly, the quality of the produce and the client experience I get is terrific, right? Really, really strong. So I think that when you then look at apples and pears and other fresh produce, people are increasingly looking online to say, well, was this produce imported? Where was it made? What were the conditions of the workers? Who's the family behind it? How long have they been farming or growing this particular type of product? That sort of storytelling, I think, is incredibly valuable in emotionally connecting with consumers who want to be part of that experience and want to feel connected to where that food comes from. Now, people might laugh and say, well, not everyone kind of gives a damn about where their food comes from, and I think that's true at one level. But with the Gen Xs and the Gen Ys, the younger generation, they are thinking about this stuff, and they want to know that when the fresh produce is coming to their table that they've purchased, that they feel good about it at an emotional level. And that means understanding more about how the product landed in their basket and what its history and origins were.
Absolutely. And that's one of the amazing things about so many of our growing businesses. They are generational and have some incredible stories to share. So, James, do you have any other insights or final closing comments that you'd like to share with industry?
Look, I think the only thing that I would say, and you've heard me talk a lot about the acceleration of change, is that what we've seen across retail and across many industries as a result of COVID, because of this acceleration of disruption, is that there is the option of standing still just doesn't exist, unfortunately. And I think that the businesses that continue to invest in their own production facilities, their own production capacities, the way that they reach out and connect with their consumers, the way they storytell their products, those are the businesses that are going to differentiate themselves from the businesses that don't. And I think there used to be a time whereby you could simply grow a product and delivering it to the customer, or the customer experience was really the job of the retailer. The modern customer who's digitally savvy and digitally connected is now thinking about their retail experience right back to the farm gate. And that's really new, right? That's kind of a new concept for a lot of people saying, well, that's not the way my business used to run. But they are thinking about right back to the farm gate. And that storytelling, I think, is just critical, which is why you've heard me talk about it today. So I hope that resonates with some of the people who watch this video.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for participating in our first 2 episodes of APEL's new TV series, James. I'm really grateful that you were able to come on and provide some more insight in addition to the video that you provided us too. So thank you so much for your time. We certainly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
What a great way to sum up all James has shared. Consumers are becoming more conscious about what happens through the supply chain, from growing conditions to packing and then into retail. And with the evolution of new technology, data and insights that we can access, it's only becoming more important and highlights the need for industry to work with retailers. So at the end of the day, consumers are getting a consistent piece of fruit that speaks quality every time. Now it's time to shift gears a little and move into a discussion between 3 guests who have extensive experience in working at retail level with different areas of expertise. Tristan Kitchener is an ex-retailer, having held senior positions in the UK and Australia. He now works as a management consultant, providing advice and support along the supply chain for major retailers through to manufacturers and primary producers. Dr. Andreas Cleaver has worked in the fresh produce and food industries for over 30 years and has held senior technical management roles in the UK and Australia. He now provides a range of quality and food safety services throughout his business, Quality Associates. And Andrew Mandermaker has 17 years experience as a fruit technical professional across global production and supply chains of apples, pears, avocado, kiwi fruit, grapes and citrus. He worked as a product technologist for Coles supermarkets and is now head of group quality and innovation at APEL. The panel session will be moderated by another APEL colleague of mine, Industry Services and Export Manager Justin Smith, who has been working closely with Andreas to scope out a quality project for the apple and pear industry.
And thanks, Rochelle. Welcome to Tristan, Andreas and Andrew to a panel discussion around quality. Tristan, Andreas spoke in his presentation about the work he's doing for table grapes, and I'm very aware that you have led that project for a number of years. Could you provide our industry with I guess, a bit of a background as to how that came about and I guess where it's evolved to today?
Yeah, sure. So really the conversation started with the Australian Table Grape Association and the retailers, which I helped facilitate going back probably 5 or 6 years now. And that was really just if you look at the Australian market, and we know that with Coles, Woolworths and Aldi, that those 3 retailers account for about 76% of the domestic sales volume of grapes in Australia. So it's highly concentrated. So there was an immediate opportunity to say, well, look, if we partner with those 3 big retailers, that's a great means to access the majority of consumers in Australia. So it was really a case of myself and the ATGA sitting down and having those one-on-one conversations with the retailers to understand where their needs were, where the industry's needs were. And there was this very logical alignment around, well, quality isn't as good as we think it could be. And therefore, what can we do to work together to address quality and essentially consumer acceptance, and therefore increase sales and demand of grapes in Australia and also export as well.
Just as a further extension to that, I'm aware that one of the big topics for the retailers was standardising specifications so that the industry was playing off I guess, an even playing field. How big a challenge was that to get the industry to come along on standardising that? And in your view, what impact did that have on the industry addressing sort of standardising and delivering that consistent consumer experience?
Yeah, so we went around a route of staying away from, if you define specifications as the way that retailers may differentiate from one another, we went more down a route of maturity standards, which is really the aspects that underpin quality throughout grapes and what we can do to improve those standards. So we went away from an average standard where by default, with an average, you have 50% that's going to be above and 50% below, and we moved to a minimum. That was probably one of the biggest and most significant changes that occurred. And the reason for that was that we had, specifications in place, standards in place that were a 16% bricks, an average of 16. Now, what we said is actually that 16 should be a minimum. And the reason was that when you move just by one bricks, you move down to 15%. We knew from a change from 15 to 16 bricks, there was a 42% increase in consumer acceptance. So a massive increase by that 1%. And that's something that retailers didn't understand, probably industry and growers weren't aware of. And this whole temptation to say, I want to be the first in with new season grapes, or oh, look, the crop's okay, retailers, it's only half a bricks off. Please, can you take it in? Well, you just dropped acceptance by 21% on that half bricks. So when you actually contextualize it in that way, it's a bit of a no-brainer to say, guys, we all need to be operating to a minimum of 16, and that's good for the consumer, which means it's good for the retailer, it's good for the grower to do that. Everyone needs to be working together. And that was the approach we took.
Fantastic. And Andreas, I guess, now that this project is a number of years in and you're still out there doing the weekly, testing at a supermarket level, are you seeing an industry now that is aligned and delivering more consistently than when this project began?
Yeah, I think we're seeing good progress. So, for example, we're now with 88% of shipments that actually are compliant. So that's a big step up. However, there's still some batches that don't actually comply. We're seeing issues still between different growing areas. So when we're stepping from one to the other region, that can be potentially still an issue at times. And we're seeing some varieties that are sort of sticking out, some of the elder varieties like Red Globe, where we actually saw a lot more quality issues. So I guess it comes down to who's involved in supply chain and the focus that individual growers and retailers have, not just on individual varieties, but also onto different growing regions. And if you're thinking about apples and pears, you can then start thinking that applies to different picks as well, and whether the fruit are CA stored or in normal atmosphere.
Tristan, I was interested in your presentation. You touched on, I guess the magnitude and multitude of varieties we have and the new managed varieties that seem to be popping up all the time. One of the things that makes those managed varieties different is they are quite fastidious about managing to a specification and meeting that minimum standard. What risk do you see that having on I guess, the commodity component of our industry, which is still such a major percentage of the apple turnover?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I think you can argue it in either way. The good thing about what the managed varieties have managed to achieve is a more consistent quality. And that's because they got brand standards, they got more control, there's more rigor around the management of those varieties. It's a little bit like how Pink Lady may be managed overseas as well. So that's giving the consumer a more consistent offering. And certainly something we saw in the Grape project is, yes, standards are one thing, but within a standard, what we found is there was also a need to include a measure around variability. So if a consumer has an inconsistent experience when they're eating a product, and in grapes, it's, one berry's sweet and one berry's acidic, that actually really turns the consumer off. The same can be related to apples. So what we're seeing is in club varieties, there may be less variability. That helps to build customer trust, customer loyalty, which then drives the repeat purchase. And that's really important in a category like apples, where you do want that week-on-week purchase. The danger is for those bigger varieties, the Pink Ladies, the Granny Smiths, and we know that 70 to 80% of consumers might only be buying one or two varieties. So if they're highly loyal to those more mainstream varieties, they could be getting a more inconsistent experience. that's going to be damaging their repeat purchase. When you look at what is happening with other categories and how, competitive intensity is increasing, and that's from grapes, obviously, but berries and stone fruit and cherries and mangoes, particularly those summer fruits. I think there's a real need for apples as a whole to ensure there's consistency of quality. And that consistency from a customer's perspective, I don't care if it's a club variety or one of the mainstream varieties, it really has to be across all apples and pears. And that's the challenge for industry.
Thanks for that, Tristan. Andrew, if I can throw to you, as the manager of quality for Pink Lady globally, and as our highest volume apple in this country, what is it that's different about the way that's managed overseas that could perhaps come back to Australia for us to improve consumer experience and I guess perhaps really drive sales with our single biggest commodity apple?
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, the way we manage Pink Lady globally and outside of Australia is very different to the way it's managed here in Australia. To Andreas's point, maturity standards are very important. So the things we focus on are really around maturity, so firmness and bricks. And to Justin's point, that's about quality control and about standards. And we monitor these things both at production country and at market country. And by having those standards and those controls that we see in managed varieties here in Australia, but applying those to a really large scale commodity product like Pink Lady has a real capacity to drive that consistency and that consistency to drive that repeat purchase.
Tristan, if we can, I guess, go back to the grape project. One of the things I've heard you talk about is that relationship between the supplier and the retailer and getting them to work together. Could you take us through, I guess, how that came about? I guess what some of the learnings and pain points were as that relationship connected at first and then grew into what it is now?
So what we saw in the table grape project was it was really important to have alignment across the supply chain with growers at one end and retailers at the other. And the implementation process we were using was a push-pull strategy. So we had a retailer pull with all the retailers, ensuring the retailers were using our testing protocols in their distribution centers. So product coming in was tested in the same way that we were testing it. And also at the other end that we worked with the ATGA from an industry perspective to have that industry push. And that was really just about making sure that the whole supply chain was aligned. And that was on the premise that, a rising tide lifts all boats. And we want all consumers to have a good experience. We want that bar for quality to be raised. So it doesn't matter if you're buying it in the majors, buying grapes in the majors, the independents, domestically or export. We want all consumers to have a good experience. And what was interesting is we had two phases to the project. The first 3 years was really about the science, developing the minimum maturity standards. And then the second 3 years, and we're year 1 out of 3 now, was around adoption, education, understanding, grower roadshows, getting in front of hundreds of growers to ensure they can understand why we're doing this and why we really want them to buy in and support it on a long-term basis. And interestingly, when we look back at some of the data and we said, well, how well are we doing? How does this compare to some of the things we did in previous years? It was really interesting in the sense that when we put the new standard in place, we look back at what we'd done the previous year, we found that we were harvesting grapes probably up to 14 days too early, which means we were never going to get the bricks in that product. We were never going to get the consistency and quality, really variable samples. We realized we just ultimately weren't going to satisfy consumers. So we're getting them really good learning now by looking back historically at our data as well to say what worked and didn't work, and that sort of tweaking and refining as we move forwards.
Thanks, Tristan. It's interesting that the point you make, and it's something we hear in our industry around, I guess, people trying to be the first mover with getting, new season fruit or a new season variety into the supermarket chains. But, I guess I'd be interested to get your view on, what detriment that can cause the category if that person's first eating experience is not what they expect it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. We have exactly the same problems in grapes where you have an export season that has a clear turn-off, and people want to get out, retailers want to get out of export as quick as they can for obvious reasons. They want to be the first on the shelf to have domestic fruit. And I remember the pressure being, wearing a retailer's hat, those meetings where you're sitting in front of the senior executives and they're all saying, we want to be the first, we want to be the first. And as a buyer, as a supermarket buyer, and Andrew and Andreas can nod to this as well, probably, you're sort of saying, hold your nerve, the quality is not there. Do not get in too early and dissatisfy consumers. What we do know from the quality data is that, it takes a further 4 to 6 weeks before a consumer will come back in if they have a poor experience. And then it takes about 2 to 3 purchases before that same level of loyalty is restored prior to that dissatisfactory purchase. Now, in the Grape project, we work very closely with Nielsen, and they do a lot of quant and qual for us. They do 3 assessments over the year and then a deep dive qual assessment. And that's provided some really good data. So just last domestic season that finished in sort of May, June this year, we saw that 94% of grape buyers that had a bad experience in, say, December 2020 were back within 14 weeks. We saw 50% of consumers come back within 3 weeks. But we know that 6% of customers didn't come back at all. So there's still work to be done there in terms of ensuring that consumers have a good experience. The danger or the challenge for seasonal products is if you stuff it up at the beginning of the season, you could potentially, if a consumer's out for 6 to 8 to 12 weeks, you could almost lose half of your season. The advantage for apples and pears is you are available year round. And you want consumers to have a seamless experience in regard to quality year round. The challenge is how do you navigate that changeover from air stored to CA stored, from old season to new season, so consumers have a seamless experience, because they don't all understand varieties and how they change over and why it's different. And I think that's the challenge from a retailer's perspective, you really want the suppliers to be able to manage that transition and the difficulty that involves in a seamless way so their consumers have a good experience as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Andreas, you and I have done, we've been working on this for I guess, maybe 6 months now. And I guess what I'd like you to give our industry a feel is you're our key intersection at the moment with the retailers, and really for our industry's understanding, the first year is about us collecting data. It's not about jumping at shadows or making snap decisions. We want to collect a good amount of data before we can enter into technically what we think comes next. But could you talk us through, I guess, in your interactions with the supermarkets, their level of support and I guess keenness for this project to progress along similar lines to grapes or perhaps mangoes as another example?
Yeah, for sure, Justin. I think it's very important for the retailers. They are definitely on board. They're providing us with information of what they're seeing in their distribution centers, and we're matching that up with data that we're getting out of their stores. And so from a retailer point of view, they really want to understand how quality impacts on what they're selling and how they can actually increase their sales. We're seeing with some of the projects like grapes, where say the season might start 2 weeks later, that's still an opportunity for the apple and pear industry to be going strong, competing on the market and making sure that the quality supports that sort of drive. And the retailers will be all up for that as well. But it, as Tristan says, it's a collaboration really between the retailers and the growers that gets us that result, because one sector can't do it by themselves. And clearly the other part is then the independence as well, because the retailers don't want to see secondary quality fruit going to some other markets, which then pulls down their offer potentially as well. So it's really the whole industry that needs to come together in that sense.
Great. Tristan, in discussions I had, in previous years with the CEO of Mangoes Australia, one of the points he made was that once they got their quality, to your point, consistent, but also that step change up, the chains and themselves were much more prepared to overinvest in marketing because they had a level of trust in what they were selling to consumers. Was that the case in the table grapes industry? Have they stepped up their marketing now they trust their product?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at it from a retailer's perspective, and they have multiple products to choose from. There's a finite amount of space, and there's a finite amount of promotional funds they're going to allocate to individual products. So, yeah, the more confidence they have in your product, the better the offering, the better the customer engagement, the more they're going to support it. And if you've got evidence to demonstrate what you're doing and why you are addressing quality, fixing quality, improving quality, I think you've got a better voice, you've got a seat at the table, and you can probably influence that decision.
Andrew, if I could throw to you, and whilst this part of our project in terms of collecting data for pairs won't kick off until next year when we have the major changeover, I'm aware you've been doing some work and will continue doing work around pair preconditioning to give that consistent product to consumers. Were you able to just give industry an update as to where that's at and what you see happening next?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. It's exciting to have pairs included in the project because apples have many times during the year when the quality really needs to be concerned. First pick, third pick, change over to CA. With pears, that's really one big opportunity, and that's the changeover from Williams to Packham pears. It's always a bit of a mess, and for the consumers, it's a real challenge for consumers to go from a late season Williams, which ripens very quickly, to a fresh out of the cool room Packham, which doesn't barely ripen at all. The consumers don't really have that level of understanding to understand that they started with one pair and now they're on another one. And ironing out the inconsistencies between that changeover is very important. And the key to that is the ripening behaviour. So to have a pear that ripens in a very predictable way, ripens very quickly with a late Williams, but still continues to ripen when they get a Packham. So it doesn't suddenly go from 1 day to 2 weeks, because consumers can't deal with that kind of ripening behaviour. Now, other industries have done this for a long time. Bananas have been doing it since before I can remember. Avocados and kiwi fruit, they all do this as well. They understand that the consumers want products they can do something with it, they can eat and enjoy it. They don't buy it to look at it, they want to eat it. And that's a real opportunity for pears, especially in that changeover. So the work we're doing with pear preconditioning dovetails quite nicely with the project that Andreas is doing around the quality and that changeover from Williams to Packhams.
I guess as we bring the panel discussion to a close, Tristan, I'm interested to get your views and the other members' views, but why should the apple and pear industry care about a project like this, engage and make these changes? What's in it for them?
I think the danger of doing nothing or staying the status quo, staying as you are, is that competitive intensity from other categories is increasing and has increased already. This grape project's been going 5 or 6 years. You look at what mango's been doing with NIR testing, non-destructive testing for maturity. You look at what berries have done with protected cropping, varietal improvements, genetics, blackberries. You can get them year round now at very affordable prices. Stone fruit, which is taking out some of those older varieties and working on their supply chain temperature management and making it quicker from when you harvest to when you consume. Cherries using high definition optical graders for internal defects. You know, the bar has been raised across all of your competitor categories. So the intensity of competition for that share of basket is not going to back away. The challenges with these projects is it does take time because you have to align the industry and you need to bring everyone along. So you really need to start doing it sooner. And it's not only about improving quality, it's about improving the consistency of quality. And to do that, it is a total industry approach, that push-pull that we talked about.
Andrew, as head of quality for industry and Pink Lady globally, what's your sort of view around why we should be doing this?
Because everyone else has is a perfectly good reason to do it. We are in a competitive market. We compete against what's available on the shelf. When people go into the supermarket to buy fruit, they don't always know exactly what they're going to buy. They're buying from a repertoire, and they're looking at the quality, their history, recent history, and the price, and making a decision pretty much as they're standing in front of that fruit. As grapes get better, as berries get better, as avocados sort out their issues, we are going to get left behind. So both apples and pears really need to step up to keep up with those things that we're competing against, with those blackberries. We really have to step up our game to make sure that we keep competitive with those things that compete against us.
Thanks, Andrew. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, Andreas, what's your view?
Yeah, I think if you look overseas at the global market, retailers have a lot of choice and they can balance out quality quite easily themselves. Whereas in Australia, we have what we've got, we're not importing. And so therefore, it's really quite important that the growers and the retailers are working closely together to get that consistent quality. As Tristan and Andrew said, the other summer fruit products, for example, they've got such a big push now behind consistent quality, delighting their customers. And I think that's what we really need to be able to compete against as one industry.
Excellent. Thanks, Andreas. And with that comes the conclusion of the panel discussion, and really delighted to have both Tristan and Andreas along. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and input. And as always, Andrew, thanks for joining the panel.
What great insights into what some of the other industries who are on a similar trajectory to ours have done to increase their retail position. The fact that half a Brix can make all the difference between someone being satisfied or otherwise really highlights the science and precision behind fruit growing. Thanks so much for watching. We look forward to bringing you the next episode soon.